This is part 1 of a 6-part story. The prompt requires a single, continuous narrative. The following is a self-contained segment, approximately 3,000 words in length, that establishes the characters and initial conflict. The first time Karen saw the goats, she thought it was a prank. It had to be. A pair of surly white-whiskered billies were headbutting a pristine, wrought-iron gate that she had personally approved for the Grand Estates at Willow Creek. Her Grand Estates. Karen's breath hitched in her throat. The gate, a symbol of meticulously planned perfection, was now a playground for livestock. This wasn't just a violation. It was an act of war. It was a Tuesday morning, a day Karen reserved for meticulous neighborhood patrols. She was in her custom golf cart, a silent electric chariot that smelled faintly of lemon-scented polish, and her signature Chanel No. 5, her iPad. A high-tech scroll of HOA bylaws was propped on her lap. She was a woman of systems and order, and her current system dictated that by 10:15 a.m., she should be documenting a slightly overgrown rosebush at Lot 22. Instead, she was staring at a farm animal brawl. The goats belonged to a new resident, a man named Marcus. He had bought the sprawling 5-acre property at the far end of the development, a piece of land that had sat empty for years, deemed unbuildable by the last developer due to its proximity to a murky creek and a thicket of gnarled oak trees. Karen, with her keen eye for a deal and her even keener understanding of the market, had seen its potential. She had lobbied the board for months, arguing that a single large lot estate would elevate the entire neighborhood's value. The board, a collection of old men who mostly just wanted to play golf and not be bothered, had finally relented. Marcus, however, was not the kind of resident she had envisioned. He wasn't a CEO or a surgeon or a retired venture capitalist. He was a biker, or at least, he had the tattoos and the leather jacket to prove it. He'd shown up to his closing in a Harley-Davidson t-shirt and jeans, his long gray-streaked hair tied back in a ponytail. He had a quiet intensity about him, a stillness that Karen found deeply unsettling. He had smiled politely, signed the papers, and had been a ghost ever since until now. Until the goats. Karen pulled the golf cart to a screeching halt, the tires kicking up a small cloud of perfectly manicured dust. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. The bylaws were clear. No livestock, excluding household pets, shall be permitted within the confines of the Grand Estates at Willow Creek. The goats, she decided, were not household pets. She snapped a photo of the two goats, one of them now attempting to chew on the decorative finial of the gate. She could feel the righteous anger bubbling inside her. This was a direct affront to everything she had worked for: the serene, manicured lawns, the symmetrical rows of identical mailboxes, the unspoken agreement that everyone would conform to a certain standard of living. All of it was being threatened by two unkempt, four-legged anarchists. She posted the photo to the HOA board's group chat, her message dripping with indignation. Urgent. Violation at Lot 37. Livestock present. Immediate action required. She knew the board members were probably on the back nine of the golf course, but she didn't care. The violation was a fire that needed to be put out immediately. Phone buzzed with a response from Bob, the board president. Karen, honey, they're just goats. Probably got loose. Let's not get our panties in a twist. Karen's face flushed. Bob, a retired insurance salesman with a perpetually tanned face and an affinity for Hawaiian shirts, had a way of patronizing her that drove her insane. He saw her as a busybody, not as the visionary she was. She typed a furious reply. They are not just goats, Bob. They are a direct violation of Article 4.7 of our bylaws. They are a threat to property values and the aesthetic integrity of our community. I am requesting a formal cease and desist letter be drafted immediately. Bob's response was a single laughing emoji. Karen threw her phone onto the passenger seat, the screen cracking slightly against the hard plastic. Her jaw was so tight it ached. Bob was useless. The board was useless. They were all useless. This, she realized, was her problem. She was surrounded by men who saw the Grand Estates as a place to retire, a place to fade into the background. She saw it as a legacy, a shining example of what a community could be with the right leadership. And the right leadership, she knew, was her. She drove the golf cart to Lot 37, the goats still chewing on the gate. She parked a safe distance away and stared at the property. The house itself was a sprawling single-story ranch, a style that was a stark contrast to the cookie-cutter McMansions that made up the rest of the neighborhood. It was a rustic, almost wild kind of beauty, with a wraparound porch and a roof made of corrugated tin. A large, weathered barn stood in the back, and a paddock, fenced with rough-hewn wood, was visible behind it. Marcus emerged from the barn, a bucket in his hand. He was wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and work boots. He moved with a relaxed, deliberate gait, his long hair catching the morning light. The goats, upon seeing him, let out a bleat and ran to him, rubbing their heads against his legs. He bent down and scratched them behind the ears, a small smile on his face. Karen watched, her heart thumping against her ribs. He was not a threat, not in the way she had imagined. He was just a man with goats. But that, she knew, was a different kind of threat. It was a threat of nonconformity, of a different way of life. It was a crack in the perfect facade she had worked so hard to build. She drove home, her mind racing. She couldn't wait for Bob and his laughing emojis. She had to take matters into her own hands. She had to be the one to enforce the rules. She was the only one who truly understood what was at stake. The next morning, Karen was up before dawn. She spent an hour on the phone with a lawyer she had on retainer for the HOA, a slick, expensive man named Mr. Abernathy. She laid out the case, citing the specific bylaws and the potential for a precedent to be set. Mr. Abernathy, a man who but appreciated a woman who knew what she wanted, agreed to draft a formal letter. But Karen didn't stop there. She didn't want a letter. She wanted action. "I need to send a message," she said, her voice low and serious. "A letter is not a message. A letter is a suggestion. I need something that gets his attention. I need something that makes it clear that we are serious." Mr. Abernathy paused. "What did you have in mind, Karen?" "I want to send the police," she said, the words a whisper of pure, cold fury. Mr. Abernathy was silent for a moment. "Karen, that's a bit extreme, isn't it? The police are for actual crimes. This is a civil matter." "It's a nuisance," she insisted, "and a violation of a legal agreement. I am the president of this board, and I have the right to enforce our rules." Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "You are not the president of the board, Karen. Bob is." The blood drained from Karen's face. She had been so consumed with her own sense of purpose, her own righteous anger, that she had forgotten. She was the vice president, Bobless the president. The board, a collection of old men who played golf and laughed at her, was the final authority. "He's a figurehead," she said, her voice tight with shame. "He doesn't care. He won't do anything." "That may be, but he is the president," Mr. Abernathy said gently. "I can draft the letter, but I can't call the police. That's a liability I'm not willing to take on." Karen hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She had been so close. She had felt the power, the control, the righteous fury of a woman on a mission. And now, she was back to where she started, a vice president with a broken phone and a useless board. She couldn't give up, not now. The goats were still there, still mocking her perfect world. She was the only one who could stop them. She was the only one who cared. She put on her finest suit, a perfectly tailored Chanel number that made her feel like a warrior. She got in her golf cart, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She was going to do what Bob wouldn't do. She was going to confront Marcus herself. When she arrived at Lot 37, the goats were gone. A large industrial-looking truck was parked in the driveway, and two men in matching uniforms were unloading what looked like a series of large metal crates. Karen, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, parked the golf cart and got out. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "What is going on here?" One of the men, a tall, burly guy with a friendly smile, turned to her. "Morning, ma'am. We're setting up the new apiary. Mr. Marcus is getting into beekeeping." Karen's mouth dropped open. "Bees," she whispered, her mind reeling. "Yep," the man said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "He's got a passion for it, I guess. Got a whole operation coming? He's hoping to sell honey at the farmer's market." Karen felt the world spin. Bees, thousands of them, swarming, buzzing, stinging. She had spent a fortune on her garden, a meticulously planned Eden of rare orchids and perfectly symmetrical rose bushes. The thought of thousands of bees, buzzing, around her pristine petunias, made her feel physically ill. This wasn't a violation, it was an infestation. She stumbled back to her golf cart, her Chanel suit feeling like a straitjacket. She had been so focused on the goats, the obvious ridiculous violation, that she had missed the real threat. The goats were a diversion, the bees were the real weapon. Marcus emerged from the house, a cup of coffee in his hand. He saw her, a small, elegant woman in a golf cart, staring at Hyde. The news van was a garish white monstrosity with a satellite dish the size of a small car. It was parked directly in front of Marcus's house. Its glossy logo, WCTV, your local news leader, a glaring insult to the Grand Estate's carefully curated aesthetic. Karen watched from her golf cart, a mix of triumph and dread churning in her gut. She had done it. She had forced the world to pay attention. But as she saw the reporter, a young woman with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and a microphone, standing in Marcus's driveway and gesturing dramatically towards the goats, a sliver of doubt began to creep in. The camera was not focused on the alleged ranching operation or the public safety threat. Instead, it was framed to capture a serene, pastoral scene. The goats, far from being a fire hazard, were grazing peacefully on a patch of wildflowers that had sprung up near the creek. Marcus, dressed in a clean t-shirt and jeans, was standing a few feet away, a small smile on his face as he scratched one of the goat's chins. He looked less like a dangerous outlaw and more like a gentle homesteader. The reporter, her voice, a saccharine sweet tone of disbelief, was speaking into the microphone. "And so, here we have it, folks. A local man's attempt at a little backyard farming, all while his neighbors are up in arms. According to our sources, the local HOA is calling this a public safety threat. But as you can see, the only threat these two friendly fellows pose is to the local weed population." She winked at the camera, then turned to Marcus. Sir, what do you have to say to your neighbors who say you're in violation of their bylaws? Marcus, his gaze calm and unwavering, looked directly into the camera. I'm a man of peace, he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble, and my goats, Barnaby and Bartholomew, are just happy to be here. My bees too. I just wanted a little bit of the country life, is all. I've never had any trouble with anyone before. He paused, his eyes shifting to Karen's golf cart, a subtle, almost imperceptible glance that made her skin crawl. I just want to live in peace. The reporter's eyes widened with delight. She had her story. This wasn't a report on a public safety threat. It was a human interest piece about a misunderstood man and his beloved goats, and the uptight HOA that was making his life miserable. Karen's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Bob. She answered it, her voice trembling slightly. Bob, I can explain. Don't you dare. Karen, he said, his voice a low, furious growl. Don't you dare. The news is calling me for a comment. They're saying I'm the president of a power-hungry board. Do you know what this is going to do to our property values? Do you know what this is going to do to my golf game? Karen, still watching the live broadcast, felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. This is what you get for doing nothing. Bob, I told you this was a problem. If you had just handled it like I suggested, handled it. You think this is handling it? You went to the media? You made us look like a laughingstock. I called an emergency board meeting. Be there in an hour, Karen. And don't you dare bring that golf cart. We're doing this in person. I'm stripping you of your title. The phone went dead. Karen's heart sank, stripping her of her title. It was more than a demotion. It was a public humiliation. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for, being undone by her own hand, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had a new problem, a bigger one. The news van was still there, and the reporter was still talking, but now she was holding a jar of honey. Marcus was standing beside her, a gentle smile on his face. He was a master manipulator, a quiet provocateur who had turned her desperate act of a public shaming into a marketing opportunity. As she drove home, her mind raced. She had to fight back. She couldn't let Bob win. She couldn't let Marcus win. She was the only one who truly cared about this community, and she wasn't going to let a couple of goats and a news report stand in her way. The emergency board meeting was a tense, solemn affair. They met in the community clubhouse, a large, airy room with vaulted ceilings and a faint smell of stale coffee. Bob, his face red with fury, stood at the head of the long table, his hands balled into fists. The other board members, all men in their late 60s and early 70s, looked at Karen with a mixture of pity and resentment. Karen, Bob began, his voice surprisingly calm. We've all seen the news. We've all seen what you did. You went, behind our backs, you ignored our counsel, and you brought a media circus to our quiet community. You made us look like fools. I was doing my job, Bob, Karen said, her voice shaking but her resolve firm. I was enforcing the bylaws. You were too busy playing golf to notice a clear and present danger to our property values. Goats and bees are not a clear and present danger. Karen, Margaret, the quiet board member, said softly, lawsuits are, and we're going to have a lot of them once this is all over. We're not going to have lawsuits if we put a stop to this now, Karen insisted. We can issue a formal cease and desist order. We can have him evicted. The bylaws state. The bylaws state that we, as a board, are to act in the best interests of the community. Bob interrupted, his voice rising with each word. And you, Karen, in your desperation, have acted in the best interests of no one but yourself. You are hereby removed from your position as Vice President of the Grand Estates at Willow Creek, HOA. Effective immediately. The words were a physical blow. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead. You can't do this, she whispered. We can, Bob said, his voice now cold and final. And we just did. You're no longer a member of this board, Karen. You're just a resident. A resident with an empty title and a lot of explaining to do. Karen stumbled out of the clubhouse, her mind a blank slate of shock and humiliation. She was no longer a warrior. She was a casualty. She was a private citizen, a woman with a perfectly manicured lawn and a very big problem. She got in her car, a pristine white Mercedes, and drove home. She didn't even bother with the golf cart. She just drove, the tires kicking up a small cloud of perfectly manicured dust. She was so consumed with her own anger and shame that she didn't even notice the two figures on motorcycles, idling on the side of the road, their chrome glinting in the afternoon sun. They were big, imposing men in leather vests, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. They watched her as she passed, and then, a few seconds later, they pulled out onto the road and followed her. When she got home, she found Robert on the phone, his face a mask of concern. He saw her and quickly hung up. Honey, you're not going to believe this. They fired me, Robert, she said, her voice flat. They fired me from the board. That's terrible. Honey, I'm so sorry, he said, but his eyes were on the window. But that's not what I was going to tell you. Karen followed his gaze. Parked in her driveway, next to her Mercedes, were the two motorcycles. The two men who had been following her, they were now standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, their hands in their pockets. They weren't smiling. They weren't talking. They were just waiting. Karen felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Who are they, Robert? What did they want? I don't know, honey, he said, his voice a whisper. But they said they were here for you. They said they were here to talk about the bikes. The bikes? The motorcycles. The biker gang she had so recklessly mentioned in her email to the news station. She had just gotten herself fired, humiliated, and now she was about to face the consequences of her actions. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the consequences were not going to be a simple cease and desist letter. She walked out the front door, her heart a frantic drum solo against her ribs. She was no longer a vice president. She was no longer a warrior. She was just a woman, standing on her lawn, facing two very large, very intimidating men. Can I help you? She said, her voice surprisingly steady. One of the men, the taller of the two, took off his helmet. He had a scarred face and a grizzled beard, and a patch on his leather vest that read Sons of the Creek. He had a quiet intensity about him, the same kind of stillness that she had seen in Marcus. He smiled, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing. Karen, he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. I hear you've been having some trouble with our friend Marcus. Karen took a step back, her mind racing. Your friend? I don't know who you are. We're his friends, the man said, gesturing to himself and his companion. And Marcus is a friend to us all. A good man. A man of peace, as he said on the news. We don't like it when our friends are harassed. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. She had stumbled into a hornet's nest. She had poked a sleeping giant with a stick, and now the giant was awake. I was just enforcing the bylaws, she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. He has goats and bees. It's a violation. He has a right to his property, the man said, his smile never fading. He has a right to live his life just like you do. We just wanted to come by and have a little chat. A little friendly chat. No, just to make sure there are no more misunderstandings. The second man, a shorter, stockier guy with a scowl, finally spoke. Yeah, he said, his voice a gravelly bark. Just making sure you know that what's his is his. And what's yours? Well, what's yours is yours. Let's keep it that way. Karen stood there, paralyzed by fear. She had been so sure she was right, so convinced that she was a hero, but now, standing on her lawn, facing TW. The roar of the motorcycles had faded, but the sound still echoed in Karen's ears. It was a visceral, guttural sound that had shattered the pristine silence of her neighborhood, and with it, the last shreds of her composure. She stood on her perfect lawn, staring at the two dark, oily tracks left on her immaculate driveway. Her husband Robert had gone inside, muttering about calling the police, but Karen knew better. The police had already laughed at her once. They wouldn't listen. Now, they would see her as the hysterical woman with a wild imagination, the same way the board had. The taunting text message, a picture of a goat on a motorcycle, was the final, infuriating insult. Fear, hot and sharp, had been her first reaction, but fear, for Karen, was a fleeting emotion. It was quickly replaced by a cold, searing rage. This was no longer about bylaws or property values. This was about respect. It was about power. Marcus, with his quiet intensity and his loyal biker crew, had challenged her in her own domain, on her own terms, and she had lost. She had been humiliated, demoted, and now, threatened. She walked inside, her expensive heels clicking on the hardwood floors, a sound that was usually a source of comfort but now felt like a desperate, hollow beat. Robert was on the phone, his voice a low, worried murmur. They were just ... big. Officer. They said something about misunderstandings. No violence. No, I just ... I think she's a little shaken up. Karen snatched the phone from his hand. This is Mrs. Reynolds, she said, her voice a steel rod. I am not shaken up. I am informing you that the two men who just threatened me on my property are part of a known gang. They identified themselves as the Sons of the Creek. You need to do something about this. The voice on the other end of the line, a different officer this time, was polite but firm. Ma'am, unless a crime has been committed, we can't do anything. We need proof of a threat. A conversation about a misunderstanding is not a crime. The bikes, the leather, the gang name, she insisted, her voice rising. Are you blind? Are you waiting for a bloodbath? They're a menace. The officer sighed. Ma'am, we have no record of a gang by that name in this area. We can send a patrol car by to keep an eye out, but that's the best we can do. Karen hung up, her hands trembling with fury. The system had failed her. The board, the police, even her own husband, were all useless. They saw her as a problem, not a victim. They saw her as a hysterical woman, not a visionary. She knew what she had to do. She had to create the proof. She had to make them see. She had to turn her fabricated reality into their undeniable truth. The next morning, Karen was up before dawn. She bypassed her usual morning patrol and drove her Mercedes, not her golf cart, to the local hardware store. She bought a large bag of concrete mix, a bag of fertilizer, a small spade, and a padlock. She paid with a credit card, a small, triumphant smile on her face. She was leaving a paper trail, but she didn't care. They would see it as a woman doing some yard work. She knew better. This was a war, and these were her weapons. Her plan was simple, and in its cold simplicity, it was brilliant. She knew Marcus's property had a well-used gravel driveway. She knew the bylaws, which she had practically memorized, required all driveways to be paved. She also knew that the Sons of the Creek were an invention of her own making, but she could make them a reality, at least in the eyes of the law. Drove to Marcus's property, parking her Mercedes a few hundred feet away, just out of sight. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in a soft, ethereal glow. Marcus's ranch, in the morning light, looked almost beautiful. The goats were nowhere to be seen, but the bees were already at work. A soft, pleasant hum in the air. Karen slipped out of her car, the bag of concrete mix heavy on her shoulder. She walked up to the edge of the property, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was trespassing. She was about to commit a crime, but she justified it, rationalized it, by telling herself she was doing it for the greater good. She was doing it for the community. She was doing it for the grand estates. She carefully poured a small pile of concrete mix in the middle of his gravel driveway. She mixed in a little bit of the fertilizer, a small detail she had read about that would make it look like a botched DIY project. She put the padlock on a small, rusted gate she had found near the creek. It was a small, symbolic act, a gesture of defiance, of ownership. She took out her phone and snapped a series of photos. Photos of the concrete, of the padlock, of the gravel driveway. She sent the photos to the police department with a short, typed message. Evidence of illegal activity. Property owner has made threats and is now constructing an illegal, unpermitted structure. The concrete is to be used as a foundation for a new clubhouse. He is also blocking access to a public easement with a padlock. It was a lie, a magnificent, terrifying lie. But it was a lie that, in her mind, was the only way to get them to listen. The clubhouse detail was the final touch, the one that would connect the concrete to the biker gang in their minds. The public easement part was a detail she had learned from her days on the board. A legal tidbit that was just believable enough to raise a red flag. She was back in her car and driving away before the sun had fully risen. A triumphant, terrible smile on her face. She had done it. She had finally taken control. She had created the evidence. She had told the story, and now, all she had to do was wait for the police to come. But she didn't have to wait long. When she got back to her house, she found a familiar, white Mercedes parked in her driveway. Margaret, the quiet, reasonable board member, was standing on her lawn, her face a mask of concern. Karen, Margaret said, her voice soft and worried. I just got a call from Bob. He said he heard you were upset. He told me to come by and talk to you. Are you all right? Karen's face tightened. I'm fine, Margaret. I'm just a little busy. What do you want? I want to talk to you about Marcus, Margaret said, her voice a gentle plea. The board is a mess. The news is calling us again. The members are threatening to sue. We think we need to make peace with him. We think we need to apologize. Karen's eyes widened with disbelief. Apologize? To that menace. He's a biker. He has a gang. I have evidence of illegal construction. I just sent the police photos. Margaret's face paled. Illegal construction. Karen, that's a very serious accusation. You didn't. I did what I had to do, Karen insisted, her voice trembling with a righteous fury. I am the only one with the courage to do what's right. You all just sit back and play golf while our community crumbles? I won't let that happen. Margaret looked at her, a look of pure pity on her face. Karen, honey, I think you need to take a step back. I think you need to breathe. We just had a meeting, the board and Marcus. He offered to fix the rose bushes on lot 22. He offered to host a community picnic with his honey. He's trying to be a good neighbor. He's making us look good. And you're making us look crazy. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. A community picnic. Her honey, he was outmaneuvering her again. He was using her own tactics against her, twisting her narrative and turning himself into the victim, the hero, the good neighbor. He was a master of psychological warfare, Margaret continued, her voice soft and pleading. Karen, he's not a threat. He's an asset. The board is going to apologize to him. We're going to give him a full-time position on the landscaping committee. We're going to name his honey Willow Creek Gold. We're going to embrace him. Karen felt her world spin. Embrace him. They were going to make him a part of the very system she was trying to protect. They were going to give him power, a voice, a legitimacy that she no longer had. She watched Margaret leave, the woman's face a mask of disappointment and concern. Karen was alone again. She was no longer a leader, a visionary, or even a warrior. She was a pariah, a broken woman with a broken plan. But just as she was about to surrender to the overwhelming wave of despair, a new, more dangerous thought began to form. They had made their decision. They had chosen him. They had chosen the bees, the goats, the bikers. Fine. She would give them what they wanted. She would give them a real reason to be afraid. She would show them what a true threat looked like. When inside, a cold, calculating resolve settling over her, she ignored Robert, who was now frantically trying to figure out how to work his new model train set. She sat down at her computer and opened her email. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. This time, she wasn't writing to the news. This time, she was writing to the City Planning Commission. She was writing about a new, more terrifying lie. A lie that would not just get Marcus into trouble, but would get his entire operation shut down for good. She was writing about an illegal structure, a concrete foundation, a small, innocent pile of concrete that she had so carefully placed in his gravel driveway. She was going to frame him, to use her own crime against him. She hit send. A feeling of cold satisfaction washing over her. She had just gone from a frustrated citizen to a criminal who was willing to risk everything to win. But then, she saw the news flash on her computer screen. A small local news story, a follow-up to the earlier one. The headline read, "Local biker crew offers to volunteer for community cleanup." The story was about Marcus and his crew, the Sons of the Creek, offering to clean up the news report was a physical blow. It was the moment Karen's meticulously constructed world of righteous indignation and unshakable purpose shattered into a million tiny, terrifying pieces. The Sons of the Creek, a name she had invented out of pure, frantic fiction, were not a gang. They were a community service organization. The final shot of Marcus, standing with a shovel and a serene, knowing smile, was a dagger to her heart. He was a hero, and she, in her single, desperate, and final act of sabotage, had just framed him as a criminal. The cold dread that had been a persistent companion for the last 24 hours, now turned into a full-blown panic attack. Her hands, which had been so steady as she typed the email to the City Planning Commission, now shook uncontrollably. The small, triumphant smile she had worn had been replaced by a grimace of pure, unadulterated terror. She had just set a trap, and she was now the one caught in it. The sound of the doorbell, a gentle chime-like melody that usually signaled the arrival of a package or a friendly neighbor, now sounded like a death knell. Robert, who had been staring blankly at the television, jumped to his feet. "Honey, the police are here," he said, his voice a terrified whisper. They're asking for you." Karen's mind raced. A whirlwind of possible scenarios. She could lie. She could pretend she knew nothing. She could feign ignorance. But then she remembered the padlock, the bag of concrete, the credit card receipt. She had left a paper trail, a breadcrumb path of her own crimes. She was no longer just a woman enforcing the rules. She was a criminal, and she was about to be caught. She opened the door, her face a mask of false calm. The two officers, a man and a woman, were not the ones who had laughed at her before. They were more senior, more serious. The male officer, a large man with a thick mustache, held a tablet in his hand. "Mrs. Reynolds," he asked, his voice low and professional, "we're here to talk about a report we received regarding illegal construction on Lot 37, and another report from Mr. Marcus about a trespassing incident on his property." Karen's stomach turned over. Marcus had beaten her to it. He had known what she was going to do, and he had already made his move. He had filed a report on her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a reedy lie. "I've been in my house all day." The female officer, a younger woman with a kind but penetrating gaze, held up the tablet. The screen showed a series of photos. Photos of Karen, in her pristine black suit, pouring concrete in the middle of Marcus's driveway. Photos of the padlock, on the small, rusted gate, the credit card receipt for the concrete mix. They had everything. "We received these from Mr. Marcus," the female officer said, her voice soft but firm. "He has a number of motion-activated cameras on his property. He also has a copy of your credit card receipt, which he obtained from the hardware store. He said you mentioned you were buying concrete for a project when you were there. We also have a statement from the store clerk." Karen felt the world spin. He had known, he had been watching. He had let her do it, let her incriminate herself, and then he had handed her over to the police. He wasn't just a rancher. He wasn't just a biker. He was a predator, a master of a different kind of game, a game she had no idea how to play. I was just, she stammered, her mind a frantic search for a plausible lie. "I was just trying to get his attention." He was in violation of the bylaws. The male officer shook his head. "Ma'am, you filed a false report. You trespassed on private property, and you attempted to tamper with evidence. Mr. Marcus has stated he will not press charges if you simply cease and desist from all further contact. But we're here to issue a formal warning. Any further incidents, and we will be forced to take legal action. Is that clear?" Karen could only nod. A single, terrified motion. The officers left, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, empty hallway of her home. Robert was standing behind her, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Karen," he said, his voice a whisper, "what did you do?" Karen couldn't meet his gaze. I was trying to win, Robert. I was trying to protect us." "Protect us," he said, his voice now a low, furious growl. "You are going to get us arrested. You are going to get us sued. Do you know what this means? We could lose everything. My retirement fund, this house, our peace of mind. All of it, just because you couldn't stand a man with goats. You went too far, Karen, you went too far." The words, coming from her gentle, kind husband, were more devastating than anything the police could have said. She had lost him. She had lost her one true ally in this ridiculous, terrifying war. She had pushed him too far, and now, he was gone. He walked away from her, and she heard the door to his basement. The room where his model train set was, closed with a final, heartbreaking thud. She was alone. Utterly and completely alone. She had no board, no allies, and now, no husband. All she had was her anger, her terror, and a growing sense of paranoia. The next day, the Grand Estates became a living nightmare. The news cameras were gone, but a new, more terrifying specter had taken their place. The Sons of the Creek. They were everywhere. They were cleaning up the creek, their loud, rumbling motorcycles a constant, low drone in the background. They were building a community garden, right in the middle of a lot that had been designated for a new, pristine gazebo. They were talking to neighbors, shaking hands, laughing. They were heroes, and Karen, watching from her window, was a villain. She saw Margaret talking to Marcus, a small, genuine smile on her face. She saw Bob, the board president, in his Hawaiian shirt, actually shaking Marcus's hand. He was holding a jar of honey. It was laughing. They had betrayed her. They had embraced the very thing she had tried to destroy. They had chosen a man with goats and a biker crew over a woman with a perfectly manicured lawn and a deep, unshakable love for bylaws. She felt a new, more dangerous kind of anger bubbling inside her. It wasn't righteous indignation anymore. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. She hated Marcus. She hated his goats. She hated his bees. She hated his biker crew. She hated the entire Grand Estates for turning on her, for choosing chaos over order. She began to see them everywhere. She saw Marcus's face in the reflection of her perfectly clean windows. She saw the glint of a motorcycle helmet behind every rose bush. She heard the low, rumbling drone of the bikes in the dead of night, even when she knew they weren't there. She was losing her mind. She was no longer a woman of purpose. She was a woman of paranoia. She was no longer a warrior. She was a cornered animal, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that cornered animals do terrible, desperate things. That night, she couldn't sleep. The low drone of the motorcycles was a phantom sound in her head. The image of Marcus's knowing smile was seared into her memory. She was in a war she had no idea how to fight, and she had just been served with the final, crushing blow. She was out. She was defeated, but then, she had an idea. A terrible, desperate, and utterly perfect idea. It was a plan that would not only expose Marcus for the menace she knew he was, but it would also put an end to his entire operation, once and for all. It was a plan that would get them all, the board, the police, the news, and most importantly, her husband, to finally see the truth. She got out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floors. She walked to the garage and grabbed a small, unmarked container from a high shelf. It was a powerful, fast-acting pesticide, a poison. She had bought it years ago, to deal with a particularly nasty infestation of ants. She had forgotten all about it, but now, holding the container in her hand, she knew what she had to do. She was going to go back to Lot 37, not with concrete, not with a camera, but with a weapon. She was going to poison his honeybees. She was going to destroy his little community service project. And she was going to prove to everyone that he was a threat, a danger, a plague on her perfect world. She was going to commit a crime, a real crime, a crime with real consequences. And she was going to do it all for the Grand Estates, for her husband, for her own twisted and desperate sense of justice. As she crept out the back door, the small innocent-looking container of poison in her hand, she looked up at the stars. The sky was black, a deep, silent void. She was alone, but a small, triumphant smile played on her lips. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a warrior. She was a soldier in a war of one. And she was about to do what soldiers do best. She was about to destroy the enemy. The ending was not a victory. It was an act of desperation, an act of a woman who had lost everything and was now willing to risk it all for one final catastrophic victory. The unresolved tension was the image of her, alone in the dark, about to poison the bees, a point of no return from which there was no coming back. The darkness was a suffocating blanket, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Karen moved through it like a ghost, the small container of pesticide a cold, heavy weight in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum solo of fear and adrenaline. She was a woman of systems, of order, but in this moment, she was an agent of chaos, a saboteur in a Chanel suit. Her mind a whirlwind of justifications and paranoid rage. She crept through the manicured hedges that separated her property from Marcus's, her bare feet silent on the cold grass. The hum of the bees, a gentle, soothing sound during the day, was a malevolent buzz in the dead of night. She saw the beehives, a neat row of wooden boxers, glowing faintly in the moonlight. She was so close, so close. A flicker of doubt, a tiny sliver of conscience, pierced her armor of fury. This was wrong. This was a crime. This was not a bylaw violation. This was an act of malice. But the image of Marcus's triumphant smile, of Bob's betraying laugh, of the news report that had branded her a lunatical of it, came rushing back, a tidal wave of righteous anger that washed away the last vestiges of her sanity. The pesticide, the smell of chemicals, a harsh, acrid assault on her senses. Her hands, which had been so steady when she was typing lies to the city commission, now trembled uncontrollably. She poured the liquid into the small vents of the beehives, a silent, terrible ritual. She felt a sick satisfaction, a perverse sense of victory. She was doing it. She was winning. She was taking back her world, one poisoned beehive at a time. But, in her haste, her shaking hands fumbled. The plastic lid of the pesticide container slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground. A small, loud sound that felt like a gunshot in the silent night. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for the lid in the darkness, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. She found it and quickly screwed it back on, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was so focused on the lid that she didn't realize her glove, a thin black latex thing she had bought for this very purpose, had snagged on a thorny branch and ripped it. She left a small, dark piece of it, a piece of irrefutable evidence, behind in the dirt. She ran back to her house, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the world a blur of trees and shadows. She locked the doors, the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place, a small, hollow comfort. She was safe. She was home. She had done it. But when she looked at her hands, she saw the truth. The left one was bare. The glove was gone. The next morning, the Grand Estates awoke to the news of a tragedy. The local news was back, but this time, the tone was not one of cheerful human it was a grim, somber report on a crime. The beehives, a symbol of community, goodwill, were silent. Thousands of bees lay dead on the ground, a carpet of tiny, lifeless bodies. The reporter, the same young woman with the perfect blonde bob, was standing in front of Marcus's house, her face a mask of sympathy. It appears a senseless act of vandalism has brought an end to what was a beautiful and heartwarming community project, she said, her voice a low, somber murmur. Mr. Marcus, who was so looking forward to sharing his honey with the community, is understandably devastated. The camera panned to Marcus. He was standing in front of the silent beehives, his face etched with a quiet, devastating sadness. He wasn't angry. He wasn't screaming for justice. He was just heartbroken. And that, for Karen, was the most terrifying thing of all. His quiet grief was a more powerful weapon than any scream of fury could ever be. He was a victim, a beloved, respected, and deeply wronged victim. The phone rang. It was Margaret, her voice a torrent of tears. Karen, it's terrible. The bees? They're all dead. Who would do such a thing? It's just so evil. Karen, her hand trembling, hung up the phone. She couldn't talk. She couldn't pretend. The guilt, a suffocating black cloud, was beginning to consume her, but the guilt was quickly replaced by a new, more terrifying emotion, paranoia. She saw them everywhere. The bikers. They weren't cleaning the creek anymore. They were riding slowly, deliberately, through the neighborhood. Their dark leather vests and the low, rumbling drone of their engines were no longer a sign of community service. They were a sign of vengeance. They were searching, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were searching for her. She locked herself in her house, pulling the blinds shut. She ignored Robert, who was trying desperately to talk to her, his voice a pleading, worried murmur. Karen, honey, the board is having another emergency meeting. They want to talk about this. They want to talk about Marcus. Karen shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. They're a gang, Robert, she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken sound. A gang. I knew it all along. They're coming for us. They're coming for me? Robert looked at her, his face a mask of shock and pity. Karen, they're not a gang. They're a volunteer organization. They're the Sons of the Creek. They're just sad. They're sad now, she said, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. But they won't be sad for long. They'll be angry, and they'll come for me. They'll know what I did. Robert walked away, a look of profound sadness on his face. He didn't close the basement door this time. He just left it open, a gaping dark maw of silence and disappointment. He was gone. She was alone. She had lost everything. She was watching the news, her eyes glued to the screen when she saw it. The close-up shot of Marcus, standing in front of the silent beehives. He was bending down, his hand reaching for something in the dirt. He picked it up. It was a small, torn piece of black latex, a piece of her glove. He held it up to the camera, a silent, devastating piece of evidence. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. He knew. The doorbell, a chime she now associated with terror, rang again. She didn't answer it. The phone rang. She didn't answer it. The doorbell rang again, a frantic, insistent sound. She heard a soft tapping on the window. She saw a face, Margaret's face, looking at her with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Karen, you have to get out of there. Margaret was mouthing, her voice a silent, frantic plea. They're coming. Karen sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her hands over her ears. She was a cornered animal, a frightened, desperate woman, who had no idea what to do. And then, she heard it. A low, distant rumble. A sound that was both a phantom memory and a horrifying reality. The sound of motorcycles. Not one or two, but dozens. Dozens of them. The sound was a low rising roar, a wave of noise that was getting closer and closer. She crawled to the window, pulling the blinds back just enough to peer outside. What she saw was a scene straight out of a nightmare. A long, continuous line of motorcycles, their chrome glinting in the afternoon sun, was rolling slowly down her street. They were big, imposing men in leather vests, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. They weren't screaming, they weren't shouting, they were just riding. The procession was led by Marcus, his face a grim mask of resolve. He was no longer a gentle rancher with a quiet smile. He was a general, leading his army. And his army was rolling into her driveway. The motorcycles parked in her driveway, in her street, on her perfectly manicured lawn. The engines fell silent. A sudden, horrifying quiet that was more terrifying than the noise had been. The bikers, all of them, stood there. They weren't moving, they weren't talking, they were just waiting. Karen was trapped. She was in her house alone, facing an army of bikers, and she had no idea what they wanted. Then, she saw him. Marcus. He got off his bike and walked to her front door. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't yelling. He was just holding a small, brown paper bag. He rang the doorbell one last time, a single, insistent chime. And then, his voice, a low, quiet rumble, came through the door. "Karen," he said, "we need to talk. The whole crew is here, and we're not leaving until we're done." The final scene was a silent, terrifying confrontation. Karen, alone in her house, facing an entire biker crew. Marcus, her nemesis, standing on her doorstep, a small brown paper bag in his hand. The unresolved tension was the quiet, menacing silence of the bikers, the ominous presence of Marcus, and the terrible, horrifying knowledge that this was not the end. This was the beginning of her reckoning. The silence was heavier than the roar of the motorcycles had ever been. It was a tangible presence, a pressure that pressed against the walls of Karen's house and rattled the windows. She was alone, a prisoner in her own home, with an army of quiet, patient men waiting on her doorstep. The small brown paper bag in Marcus's hand seemed to hold the weight of the world, a final damning piece of evidence that would seal her fate. She saw a flash of red and blue lights in her rear view camera, a silent flickering dance against the dusk. The police were here, and behind them, a white van with the familiar logo of WCTV, your local news leader. The world, it seemed, was watching. They were all here for her final act, the grand finale of her self-imposed tragedy. A slow, deliberate knocking came from the door, not a frantic, angry pounding, but a series of measured raps that spoke of an unshakable resolve. "Karen," Marcus's voice came through the thick wood. "The police are here. The news is here. It's over. Just open the door." Karen, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a new, terrible understanding, stumbled back from the door. She had been so wrong about everything, about Marcus, about his crew, about herself. She had been a villain in a story where she thought she was the hero, and now she was at the end of her rope. A new voice, a man's voice, came from the door. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is Officer Sanchez. We need you to open the door and talk to us. We have a report of a possible trespass and vandalism. We also have a statement from Mr. Marcus and his crew. Please, just open the door." Karen, a cornered animal, a frightened woman with nothing left to lose, finally found her courage. Not the false, righteous courage of a bylaw enforcer, but the raw, desperate courage of a person who has to face the music. She walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the deadbolt. She had to do it. She had to face them all. She opened the door. Marcus was standing there, his face no longer a mask of grief, but of quiet, patient resolve. Behind him, the crew of Sons of the Creek, a sea of leather and chrome, stood in a silent, watchful line. Behind them, the police, and behind them, the news crew, their cameras trained on her front door. The entire world, it seemed, was her witness. Marcus held out the paper bag. "I think you'll want to see this," he said, his voice a low melodic rumble. "It's the evidence you left behind." Karen, her face pale with shame, reached for the bag, her fingers trembling. She opened it and looked inside. It wasn't the piece of her glove. It wasn't the pesticide container. It was a jar of honey. A small, golden jar of honey with a handwritten label that read, "Willow Creek Gold." Karen looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide with confusion. "I don't understand," she whispered. "The bees, they're all dead. I saw them." Marcus's smile was a slow, terrible thing. "The old ones are." "Yes," he said. "The ones who are old and sick, but the young ones, the queen bee, the healthy ones, they're fine, they're safe." He reached into the bag and pulled out a second jar. This one was full of a different kind of honey, a darker, richer color. "This," he said, his voice now a low, chilling whisper, "is the first batch of honey I ever made. It's a bit of a local legend. I call it fool's gold." Karen looked at the honey, then at Marcus. Her mind, a whirlwind of confusion, was trying to piece together the puzzle. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus's face hardened. "Because, Karen, you're not the first person I've had to deal with, and you won't be the last. I came here for a reason, not just for the peace and quiet, not just for the goats and the bees. I came here because I am the president of a national organization, a non-profit, The Sons of the Creek. We're a brotherhood of retired police officers, firefighters, and first responders. And we buy up old forgotten properties like this one. We turn them into community centers, into places for kids to learn and grow. We wanted to build a community garden, a place for beekeeping, a place for all the kids to come and play. But we couldn't, not with the kind of crazy that was happening here. Kieran felt the world spin. But the police, they didn't know. They're not my crew, Marcus said with a shake of his head. They're a local chapter of a much larger national organization. We operate under the radar. We wanted to see what you were made of. We wanted to see if you would come around. If you would listen to reason. He paused, his gaze cold and unwavering. You didn't. Karen's face was white. But the bikers, the crew, the news. The news was a setup, Marcus said, his voice flat. The bikers were my crew. They're all retired cops. They're all family, and they're all watching you right now. The goats were a test. The bees were a test. And you, Karen, you failed them all. Karen looked at the ground, a single tear of shame rolling down her cheek. She had been so wrong. She had not been a hero. She had been an obstacle. She had not been a warrior. She had been a fool. But the lie, she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken sound. The lie to the police. The lie to the city commission. Marcus smiled, and it was a terrible, beautiful thing. That's why the police are here, Karen, he said. They're here to talk to you, not about the honey, not about the bees, but about the illegal construction you reported, the concrete you laid in my driveway, the false report, the tampering with evidence. It's all on camera. It's all on file. Karen looked up at him, her heart a frantic drum solo of pure, unadulterated terror. But you said you wouldn't press charges, she stammered. I said I wouldn't press charges for the trespassing, Marcus said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. But the other stuff, Karen, the lies, the false reports, the attempts to get me in trouble with the law, that's a different story. And I'm afraid, Karen, that's not up to me. He stepped back, a small, triumphant smile on his face. The police officers, their faces grim and unsmiling, stepped forward. They were not there for Marcus. They were there for her. Mrs. Reynolds, Officer Sanchez said, his voice professional and cold, we're going to have to ask you to come down to the station with us. We have a few questions for you, and we're going to need to talk to your husband as well. Karen looked past the police to Robert, who was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of profound disappointment. He didn't look at her. He just looked at the ground, a silent, terrible judgment. Karen looked at Marcus, then at the biker crew, all of them standing in silent, menacing judgment. She had been defeated, humiliated, ruined, and it was all her own fault. The final scene was of Karen, a small, elegant woman in a black suit, walking slowly to the police car. The flash of the news cameras, a blinding, brutal final memory. She was alone. She was a criminal. She was a cautionary tale. The unresolved tension, however, was in Marcus's final smile, a smile that was not of victory, but of something far more complex and dangerous. It was a smile that said, I'm not the hero in this story either. I'm just a man who's here to do a job, and I'm not finished yet. Not with you, and not with the grand estates. The final mystery was in the true purpose of his organization. The Sons of the Creek, and what kind of job a brotherhood of retired first responders was really there to do. The story, it seemed, was far from over.